if we think about this one fellow who was a medical student, a doctor?
He's a doctor, yeah.
A doctor, okay. So if he were to try to get a job in this country, well, I mean, if he can't live with our culture, what's he do?
I guess he goes back to Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Yeah, he'd have a hard time greeting patients without shaking their hands, probably.
Oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
What are the different ways that people greet each other?
Oh. Oh, a lot of different ways. Well, let's take, for example, a Japanese business person. People in Japan consider that business cards, are really important. And a lot more than we do here in the States. Like, you probably have a business card, right, that you give out to people. For example, if I was a Japanese person and I gave you my business card and you turned it over and you wrote something on the back of it, that would not be a good idea in Japan. Because it would be a little bit insulting to the people there. But to take the business card, to look at it carefully and to study it, that would be something that they would do. Because the business card for them is something that reflects who they are and also their company. And that's really important. Whereas here in the States, of course, we need business cards because people can refer to them later and find our phone number and email and all of that. But to us, writing on a business card is no big deal. We don't even have a second thought about that, right?
In fact, a lot of business cards nowadays, they have lines on the back of them so you can take notes.
Right. So that would be a funny greeting. Another thing that we do in the United States that's different from a lot of Asian countries is that we're pretty casual about introducing people. For example, I would never probably not pay attention if I had an older person and a younger person and I introduced them to each other. I probably wouldn't pay attention which one's name I said first, like who I introduced to who. Whereas in many Asian countries, it's really important that you introduce, that you show honor to the older person or the person higher up on the level of seniority. For example, in a company or a university, you would show them honor by being the person that's more respected in an introduction.
This reminds me of the issue of gifts. Now, in Latin America, I have not come across too many situations where gift giving was an issue. But now you may know something that I'm not thinking of about that.
Yeah, there are, gift giving can be a real issue, especially for professional people. For example, if someone is invited to the home of someone higher up in the company where they work, or for example, if you're invited to the home of the dean of your department in a university, or something like that, whether or not you bring a gift as you go to their home for the meal will depend on what country you come from and kind of your background in that. Of course, here in the States, it wouldn't be uncommon to bring some flowers or maybe some special small gift for a host or hostess. But for example, in people from the Middle East, it would be very common to bring an expensive gift to the home of your host or hostess when you're invited for a dinner. But there's some problem with that here in the States that you have to be careful of, because if you're invited to the home of your boss, sometimes it can be really looked down upon if you bring an expensive gift, because it may be seen as, trying to win favor with somebody who's higher up in the company than you are.
So what you're really talking about, I need to remind everybody about this.
Okay.
What you're really talking about is that these are things you have to teach people who are coming over to our country to study.
Right.
And then most of them will be going back.
Right. So of course they're not going to take the American customs and use them in their countries. They're going to use the American customs while they're here. And most of the people I work with are very curious about what we do and how things will work here. Sometimes they get irritated about things. I was thinking of an example of one of my students was invited to a wedding. And it was an American person who was getting married. And so she emailed me and said, I'm invited to this wedding. What kind of gift should I bring and how much money should I spend? Because, how much money you spend on a wedding present is very different in different cultures and also depending on how well you know the person. So it's fun to be able to have a good enough relationship with somebody from a different culture to be able to talk, openly about those kinds of things. Okay, let me give you an example of one of my previous students, and she was from Asian country, and she was working in a lab and doing research, and she suddenly heard from her boss that he wasn't happy with her work. And so she was very upset because she had spent Christmas Eve at work, she had spent New Year's Eve at work, she was working constantly all the time very hard, she was working very hard, and she thought she was doing a really good job. And so her boss said, well, I'm having some problems with your work. And so she was very upset, and she came to my office and she was crying and she was really upset about this. And I said to her, well, did you ask him exactly what the problem was, and how could you fix the problem, or how could you do better? And she said, no, I didn't. And we talked about that for a while, but what had happened was apparently her boss was not the kind of person to give very directive ideas about how to improve, and at the same time it was her culture that she would not ask those questions. For example, she would not say, oh, well, what can I do to improve? What specific things can I do to make my job better? It ended up that she lost her position in the research lab, and she eventually had to return to her country.
Let me guess, the Americans didn't understand what was going on, and she didn't understand them.
Right, and the communication was very bad. And it was not just, it was a cultural thing, but it was also a personality thing. I think if the cultural problem hadn't been there, they probably could have overcome the personality problem. But with both of those problems, it was too much.
So really, this whole subject about knowing, well, you were calling it a skill.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I noticed that most American citizens aren't aware of because they don't speak other languages is that in the immigrant communities, the leaders are telling their people, that is, the ones who come from their country and speak their language, they're telling them all the time, learn English, learn English. And in fact, the immigrants are usually learning way more English than the people here are learning of other languages.
That's true. I do think that it is important for people to learn English, and as you agree too. But I can give you some idea from a professional viewpoint. Some of the professors and investigators, primary investigators in the labs where I work, research labs, have labs that most of the postdocs and people who are doing research are from a different country. And some of them, for example, might by some reason all be from the same country. So anyway, the people were speaking their own language in the lab, and so the person who was the boss of the lab said, you guys need to speak English while you're at work. Even if you're all speaking the same language, it needs to be English. And so, but they tried for a couple of days, and they would always start speaking their own language again. And so apparently the boss, who was a very famous researcher and very well known in his field, doesn't like this very well. His comment was that people who speak a different language than English at work or in the lab will never be able to be successful in the American system of doing research.
Because these people in this particular area, working with research, would have to be able to report their results.
Yes.
And discuss them in committees
Right.
and conferences, and
In
so that's the place for them.
Lab meetings and conferences, and in all kinds of people discuss their results because they're doing research in this particular situation that no one in the world has ever done. And so this is research that they need to communicate, and they need to communicate it quickly and efficiently.
Yes.
And their career will depend on how well they can communicate that research. And so if they're always speaking in a different language in the lab, they're not practicing their English, they don't have the vocabulary in English, and what if they have to communicate with someone from Germany, for example? Are they going to speak German? No, they're going to speak English when they communicate that research.
Well, this is a very good point. And there is a Mexican-American lawyer in the Indianapolis area who I've heard many times on the radio tell the people In fact, I heard another attorney also telling the people in Spanish, and it was a Spanish program, speak English at home. Practice it with each other. And this is what I tell my students. Practice Spanish with anybody at home or on the school bus, anybody who is willing to do that with you. And the people around you, they just have to accept the fact that you must practice a language to learn it. So there's a time for using other languages out in the open. I mean, if somebody's around you and you're not working with them, you don't have to avoid practicing another language. At some point, we have to practice language.
Right.
And yet some jobs, they require you to speak good English. So this is an example where speak English. It's not because it's America, though.
No.
It's
It's a requirement. It's a requirement for the job.